She wore her sister's wedding dress to the funeral, and the rancher whispered, "You are enough." The church bell tolled slow and heavy, each note rolling across the valley as though it were grieving too. It was November in the year 1885, and snow clung to the ground outside the small wooden church. Inside, every pew was filled. Men removed their hats and held them tight in their laps. Women pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths as the hymn faded into silence. They had gathered to honor the dead, husbands and sons taken by war or illness, and the air was heavy with sorrow. The white steeple of the snow pine church rose against a gray sky like a prayer carved into wood, but prayers did little to soften the harsh eyes of a town that judged too easily. The doors creaked open, and all heads turned. Clara Whitfield stood in the doorway, her hands clasping a small lily, her chin lifted higher than her heart felt. She wore a dress she had kept folded in her chest for years, ivory satin that once belonged to her sister, its seams yellowed with time, its bodice too tight against her full figure. The fabric strained with each careful breath she drew, but she did not lower her eyes. She stepped forward slowly, each boot heel tapping against the wood, each sound louder than the last note of the hymn that had ended moments before. Whispers broke out like sparks catching dry straw. "Is that her sister's wedding dress?" someone muttered. Another voice hissed that she looked foolish, that the gown was never meant for her shape. Laughter followed, sharp, meant to wound. Clara heard every cruel word as if it were a lash across her back, but she kept walking. She reached the front and placed the lily on the altar, where names of the fallen were written on white slips of paper. Her hands trembled in their gloves, her throat tight with shame. She remembered her sister wearing the same dress on the day she married. How proud their family had been, how lovely she looked, thin and graceful. Clara had been told all her life that she was too large, too plain, a shadow of what a woman should be. She had believed it too often, but today she wanted something different. If she wore the dress, perhaps for a moment they would see that she had once belonged to love, that she had a right to grieve as much as any widow. A laugh rang out from the back pew, cruel and deliberate. Clara froze, her breath sharp in her chest. Heat flooded her cheeks, and her vision blurred. She could not stay, not beneath their eyes, not with their whispers digging into her soul. She turned and walked back down the aisle, her steps quickening as tears threatened to fall. The cold struck her face as she pushed open the doors and stepped into the snow-filled afternoon. She gripped the rail of the porch, her chest rising in shamed gasps, her eyes stinging. She did not notice the man standing near the oak post, watching quietly. His hat was low, his coat buttoned against the wind. He had seen the way they laughed, and he had not joined them. Clara pressed the handkerchief to her eyes, her heart breaking. But somewhere in the silence of the snow, a different story was waiting to begin. The wind bit hard as Clara stepped down the church steps, her boots sinking into the frozen slush. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though no fabric could shield her from the sting of the laughter still echoing in her ears. The sky above was a dull gray, heavy with snow, that promised to fall again before night came. Her breath rose in white clouds, quick and uneven, as though her chest could not decide whether to hold the shame in or let it break free. She wanted to keep walking until the sound of the hymn and the cruel voices behind her were nothing but fading memory. But her feet slowed when she reached the end of the porch. She realized she was not alone. A man stood there, leaning against the oak beam that held up the church awning. His figure was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a coat, fastened tight against the weather. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes that studied her with a calmness that made her uneasy. He had not made a sound until now, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough like gravel, but soft enough to carry kindness. "I saw what they did," he said. Clara startled, her hand tightening on the railing as she turned her head toward him. She expected pity in his expression, perhaps amusement, but his face was unreadable, steady as the mountains in the distance. She tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. The shame felt too heavy to carry into speech. All she could manage was a quiet, "I only wanted to honor them," her voice trembling, her eyes darting away. The man nodded once, not with judgment, but as though he understood the weight of what she meant. "You did," he said simply. His words struck her more deeply than she wished to admit. She shook her head. "They laughed," she whispered, her breath quick and uneven. "They always laugh." His answer came without hesitation. "They may not know better." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a folded handkerchief, worn but clean. He held it out to her without a word. For a moment she hesitated, afraid that taking it would mean admitting her weakness, but his silence pressed gently on her, offering not demand, but respect. She took it at last, pressing it to her eyes as tears slipped through despite her will. "Why do you care?" she whispered, voice almost lost in the wind. He lifted his chin slightly, his gray eyes catching hers. "Because everyone deserves to be seen with respect, especially when they are grieving." There was no pity in the way he spoke, no mockery, only a truth that felt rare in her world. She looked at him for a long moment, unable to speak, then turned her gaze back toward the valley, her heart still trembling but carrying, for the first time in years, a small flicker of warmth. Snowflakes drifted down from a gray sky, as Clara followed the stranger down the narrow path that led away from the church. She had not meant to walk beside him, but her feet carried her in the same direction, and he did not seem to mind. His stride was steady, his silence calm, and though she still felt the sting of laughter pressing against her heart, there was something in his quiet company that steadied her breathing. At last he spoke, his voice low, measured, almost careful. "My name is Elias Boone," he said. "I keep a ranch north of town." Clara nodded, unsure whether to offer her name. She finally whispered, "Clara Whitfield," and the sound of it seemed strange, as though she were reminding herself she still had a place in the world. They reached the hitching post, where a small wagon waited, the horse shifting its weight and puffing steam into the cold air. A little girl sat bundled in the seat, her curls spilling out from beneath a knitted cap, her cheeks red from the cold. She leaned forward the moment she saw Clara, her eyes wide and curious. "Daddy," she called, her voice carrying a note of delight. "Who is that?" Elias rested a hand on the side of the wagon. "This is Miss Whitfield," he said simply, though the title sounded like more respect than most in town had ever given her. The girl climbed down clumsily, her boots slipping against the snow-packed earth. She rushed to Clara's side without hesitation and tilted her head back to look at her. For a long moment she simply studied Clara's face, her round cheeks, the folds of her dress, the way her gloved hand still clutched the handkerchief Elias had given her. Then, with a bright grin, the child spoke. "Pretty lady," she announced. The words rang louder than the church bell had that morning. Clara froze, her heart leaping and breaking at the same time. She had not been called that in years, not even in kindness, and to hear it now from a child's lips shook her so deeply she could not breathe. Her eyes blurred with tears, and she bent slowly to meet the little girl's gaze. "What is your name, sweetheart?" she whispered. "June," the girl said proudly, and she slipped her small hand into Clara's without hesitation. The warmth of that touch pierced through the cold and through the ache that had followed Clara all her life. She could not speak for a moment, afraid her voice would tremble too much, so she only smiled. June smiled back, bright and easy, as if beauty was not something weighed or measured, but simply seen. Elias watched from a few steps away, his face unreadable, though there was the faintest softening in his eyes. Clara straightened slowly, June's hand still in hers, and for the first time in many winters, the snow around her did not feel so bitter. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled north across the frozen ground, the horse snorting plumes of steam into the gray afternoon air. Clara sat on the wooden seat beside Elias, her gloved hands folded in her lap, the child June nestled between them, humming a tune only she seemed to know. Clara had not expected to ride away from the church with strangers, yet somehow she did not feel like a stranger at all, at least not to the girl. Every so often June would look up at her with wide brown eyes, and each time she did, Clara felt the echo of that sweet voice calling her pretty lady. The words clung to her, warming her more than the shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She stole a glance at Elias, who drove the horse without hurry, his face calm, unreadable, the brim of his hat catching flecks of snow. He did not speak much, but when he did, his voice seemed as steady as the land itself. By the time they reached Hollow Brook Ranch, the sky was turning the color of iron, the sun hidden behind thickening clouds. Clara gazed at the wide stretch of land, the barns and fencing, the smoke rising from a chimney in the main house. It looked lonely, though not in the way an empty house looks lonely, but rather as though it had been waiting too long for laughter to fill it. Elias stopped the wagon and helped June down first, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted her. He then turned to Clara and offered his hand, and though she hesitated, unsure if her weight would be a burden, he did not pull it away. She placed her hand in his and stepped down, her boots crunching against the snow-packed earth. Inside, the cabin was warm but silent. The fire in the hearth burned steady, casting light over the wooden table and the worn chairs. A rug lay across the floor, faded but clean. Clara set her bag near the door, her heart twisting with unease. She had never been invited into another's home like this. Not since she lost her family. Not since she had been told again and again that she did not belong anywhere. June bounded across the room, tugging Clara by the hand to show her a shelf lined with small wooden animals, each carved by careful hands. "Daddy made them," June said proudly, and her smile filled the quiet room with brightness. Elias watched them, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. "The house has been too quiet," he said after a moment. Clara turned toward him, uncertain of his meaning. "June needs someone kind here," he continued. "Someone steady." Clara's throat tightened. She looked at the fire, then at June clutching the wooden horse, then back at Elias. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "I do not know if I am the right person." He shook his head. "You came here today when others mocked you. You held your ground. That is more than most." Clara lowered her gaze, her cheeks warm. For years she had been told she was too much, too big, too clumsy. Yet here was a man who spoke of her as if she were enough. The silence of the house lingered, but for the first time it did not feel empty. It felt like it might be waiting for her. Morning light filtered through the small cabin windows, casting pale gold across the wooden floorboards. Clara stood in the kitchen, with her sleeves rolled, her hands trembling as she tried to knead dough the way she had seen others do. The flour clung to her fingers in sticky clumps, and no matter how she pressed or folded, the lump in the bowl refused to become anything graceful. She bit her lip and pushed harder, telling herself she would make something decent, something to prove she was not just another burden. June sat at the table swinging her legs, humming a tune while she traced circles in the flour dust with her fingertip. Every so often she would look up at Clara with that wide smile that carried no judgment at all, and it made Clara's chest ache with both joy and fear. By noon the bread was in the oven, the smell promising more than the taste ever would. Clara hovered near the stove, peeking in through the small iron door, as if her watchfulness could save the loaf. When she finally pulled it out, her heart sank. The top was blackened, the crust hard as stone. She tapped it with her knuckle, and the sound was sharp, hollow, unforgiving. Her cheeks burned. She placed the bread on the table anyway, her hands stiff, her pride crumbling faster than the loaf itself. June reached out, eager, but one bite made her scrunch her face. Clara snatched the plate away before the child could say anything. "I am sorry," she muttered, voice tight. "I cannot seem to do even this right." Elias had come in while she spoke, the cold still clinging to his coat, his boots leaving damp prints on the floor. He looked at the bread, then at Clara's face, but he said nothing cruel. Instead, he took off his hat and set it on the peg, then stepped past her to place a small bundle on the counter. "Warm water," he said simply, "for washing." Clara blinked at him, confused. She had expected a sigh, a lecture, or at least the quiet shake of a head she knew too well from the past. Instead, he gave her a gift that spoke louder than any correction. Warm water in a bucket, steam rising into the cold air of the room. She swallowed hard and nodded, unable to speak. That night, after June had gone to bed, Clara sat alone at the table, staring at her hands. They were roughened from work, clumsy, untrained, but they had not been scolded. She remembered the bread blackening in the stove, the stew she had spilled yesterday, the plate she had dropped the day before, yet each mistake had been met with the same quiet steadiness. No cruel laughter, no mocking words, only small gestures that told her she was not failing, she was learning. She pressed her hands together and closed her eyes, breathing deep. The cabin was quiet, but not with emptiness. It was the kind of quiet that made space for something new, something fragile, something that felt almost like belonging. The frost clung thick on the fence rails that morning, glittering in the weak light of the sun as Clara hung a row of damp linens. Her breath rose in pale clouds, her fingers stiff with cold, but she worked carefully, smoothing each cloth before pinning it in place. Behind her, June's laughter drifted across the yard, high and bright, chasing away the silence that so often pressed against the cabin walls. Clara turned her head and saw the child skipping across the frozen grass, her curls bouncing, her boots leaving small tracks in the frost. The sight warmed her heart, but the warmth turned to fear when she realized June had wandered past the fence line, closer to the open paddock where 3 unbroken horses stamped restlessly. Clara dropped the last cloth, her pulse quickening. "June," she called, her voice sharp, but the girl only turned with a grin, too far to hear the worry laced in the sound. One of the horses, a silver gray with a mane like tangled smoke, snorted and reared its head, sensing the sudden movement. Clara's breath caught. She saw the danger before June did, the wild toss of the animal's head, the pounding hooves against the hard ground. Her body moved before her mind had time to think. She gathered her skirts and ran, her boots crunching through the frost, the cold biting her face, her heart pounding in her ears. June froze as the horse lunged forward, startled by the girl's small frame. Clara flung herself across the distance, arms outstretched, scooping the child against her chest and turning her back toward the animal. She braced for the blow, for the weight of hooves and muscle, but in that same moment, another shadow surged beside her. Strong arms wrapped around them both, pulling them back through the gate as the horse veered off with a sharp snort. They collapsed into the dirt, Clara gasping for breath, June sobbing into her shoulder. The world spun in Clara's vision, her body trembling from the fear that gripped her so tightly she could not let go of the child. When she lifted her head, she saw Elias crouched beside them, his chest heaving, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. His hand brushed over June's curls, his voice rough but gentle. "You're all right," he whispered, though his eyes told Clara how close they had come. June clung tighter to her, her small fists gripping Clara's shawl as though she feared to let go. Clara's throat burned as she held the girl closer, rocking her, whispering soft words she barely knew she remembered how to say. Elias's gaze lifted to Clara then, and for a long moment, the world seemed to still around them. His eyes did not linger on her size or her clumsiness, not on the mistakes she had made in his home, but on the way she had thrown herself between his daughter and danger without a thought. "You didn't even hesitate," he said quietly, almost in wonder. Clara's lips trembled. "She was out there alone," she whispered. "I couldn't let her face it." Elias's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. His voice dropped low, steady, carrying a weight she felt settle in her chest. "You're more important than you think, Clara." She turned her face away, unable to meet the truth in his words, her heart beating too hard to trust her voice. The wind stirred the frost across the ground, and June sniffled into her shoulder. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt not like a burden, but like someone needed. And that thought, fragile as it was, burned brighter than the cold around her. The air in town carried the smell of apples and wood smoke, and Clara held her basket tight against her hip as she walked along the wooden planks of the general store porch. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she had begun living at Hollowbrook Ranch, and though each day brought its own stumbles and small mistakes, she was beginning to feel the faint roots of belonging. June had taken to her as if they had always been together, and even Elias, though quiet and hard to read, had shown her more patience than she had known in years. Still, Whispers clung to her like shadows whenever she came into town. She heard them now, muttered behind hands, thin smiles that carried barbs sharper than knives. She kept her chin high, pretending their words did not scratch at the walls of her heart, though inside they did. As she stepped down from the store, the weight of the basket heavy in her arms, a voice called out behind her, "Well, if it isn't the belle of the scandal." The words slid over her skin like oil, familiar and sickening. She froze before she turned, her breath catching when her eyes met his. Samuel Pike stood there, tall and polished, his coat too fine for the dust of Montana, his boots gleaming as though he had never known a day of work. His smile was wide but empty, his eyes pale and sharp, the same eyes that once had followed her too closely in the library back in Red Valley. Her stomach twisted. She gripped the basket harder, though her hands trembled. "What are you doing here, Samuel?" she asked, her voice thin. He stepped closer, his boots clicking against the boards. "I heard whispers," he said smoothly, "about a woman with red cheeks and a past no one could quite name. I had to see for myself if the rumors were true." Clara stepped back, the basket nearly slipping from her grasp. His smile widened, full of teeth. "No need to look so frightened. I came with an offer." She shook her head, her throat tight. "I want nothing from you." He scat, tilting his head. "Oh, but you do. Your name is still dirt in Red Valley, still written in hushed tones and half smiles. But I could change that. Letters, a retraction, a kind word in the right ears. Enough that you could walk into a church without them laughing." She stared at him, bile rising. "And in exchange," she asked, her voice flat. His smile shifted, colder. "For finishing what you started," he whispered. Her hand moved before she thought. The slap cracked across his cheek, sharp in the cold air. Samuel staggered back, eyes wide with surprise. "You lied," Clara said, her breath shaking. "You ruined me, and you think I would let you own me again." He straightened, anger flickering in his gaze. "I gave you a way out," he snapped. "I gave you the chance to matter." Before Clara could answer, another voice cut through the air, low and steady, strong as the land itself. "She already does." Both turned. Elias stood by the fence gate, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. His steps were slow, each one deliberate, until he stood near enough that Samuel's bravado seemed to shrink. "This is between us," Samuel said, but Elias shook his head. "No. You made it about the town when you spread your lies. You made it about me when you showed up here thinking she was still defenseless." Samuel's eyes narrowed, his words sharp. "You don't know what she did." Elias's gaze did not waver. "I know she wakes before dawn," he said, his voice like thunder. "I know she works harder than anyone. I know she threw herself in front of a horse for my daughter. And I know there is not a thing about her that needs your permission to be whole." Samuel faltered, his shoulders stiffening as if struck. Clara stood frozen, her chest tight, her eyes burning with tears she fought to hold back. For the first time in years, someone had spoken for her, not over her, not in pity, but in truth. Samuel adjusted his coat, muttered under his breath, and turned away. His fine boots carried him back down the road, his figure shrinking into the distance. Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Elias turned to her, his eyes softer now, though still steady. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded faintly, though her body trembled with the weight of everything that had just been said. In that moment, standing between the whispers of her past and the strength of the man before her, Clara felt something shift inside her, fragile, yet unshakable. For the first time, she was no longer running from the past. She was standing in the present, and she was not standing alone. The wind cut sharp across the valley as Clara carried a basket of apples from the market, her boots crunching against the hard-packed snow. The murmurs started before she reached the end of the street. She felt eyes on her, felt the weight of words whispered just low enough to sting without being answered. "There goes the woman from Red Valley," one voice muttered. "I heard she was run out for scandal," another added. A laugh followed, thin and cruel. Clara gripped the basket tighter, her fingers aching against the wood of the handle. She lifted her chin, determined not to show how deeply it hurt, but each step felt heavier than the last. She had thought Elias's defense would silence them, thought that his steady words and his presence beside her would change the way the town looked at her. But rumors had roots deeper than truth, and once planted, they spread. By the time she returned to Hollow Brook, her heart felt raw, as though the cold had seeped inside her chest. She busied herself with chores, keeping her head bent, trying not to let June see the sadness on her face. The little girl was too quick to notice, though, too bright to miss the way Clara's eyes shone when she turned away. That evening, after June had been tucked beneath her patchwork quilt, Clara moved quietly through the kitchen, putting away the last of the dishes. Through the frosted window, she heard voices outside, carried clear on the brittle wind. She paused, her hand stilling on a cup, as she realized one of the voices belonged to Reverend Miller. "Your daughter needs stability," he said firmly. "A home should have a mother as well as a father." Clara's heart clenched, the words striking sharper than the whispers in town. Then came Elias's voice, low and steady. "I don't need another wife, Reverend." The cup slipped from Clara's hand and clattered into the wash basin. She hardly noticed. "I didn't ask her to stay here for that," Elias continued. "I needed help with June, and she has done more than anyone expected. That's all." The last two words cut her deeper than any insult. That's all. She pressed her hand against the table, her breath shallow. So that was what she was to him. A pair of hands to fill a quiet house, a place filler, until the town approved of something better. She turned from the window, her eyes burning. In her small room she sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers brushing against the wooden comb he had left her days ago. She stared at it for a long time before she set it back on the table. Slowly she reached for her satchel and began to fold her shawl, tucking away what little she owned. Not everything, only enough to leave without a sound. Her chest ached as she glanced toward June's room. "She will forget me," Clara whispered to herself. "Children always do." The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. But inside the cabin the quiet was heavier still, heavy enough to break her heart. The night was darker than ink, the kind of dark that swallowed the world whole. Snow fell heavy from the sky, whipped by a cutting wind that rattled every shutter and bent the tall pines until they groaned. Clara wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders as she slipped out the door of the cabin, her satchel clutched close. Each step through the drifts crunched sharp beneath her boots, the sound nearly lost against the howl of the storm. Her breath came in ragged bursts, half from the cold, half from the ache in her chest. She told herself she was only leaving to spare them, to spare herself, but each step felt like tearing another piece of her away. Back inside the cabin, June stirred in her bed. The room was too quiet, too still. She opened her eyes and padded barefoot down the hall to Clara's room. When she found the bed made neatly, the wooden comb gone from the table, her heart sank. "No," she whispered, her small voice breaking. "She wouldn't leave me." She grabbed her coat from its peg and rushed outside, her little boots vanishing into the snow. Clara had not gone far when she heard it. A faint cry carried thin on the wind. She stopped, her heart lurching, then heard it again. June. Panic shot through her, sharper than the cold. She spun, lantern swinging wildly in her hand, its weak light casting trembling shadows across the drifts. "June!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "Where are you?" Her boots sank deeper, with every frantic step, as she stumbled toward the sound, the storm clawing at her with icy fingers. Then, just beyond the slope of a snow-filled hollow, she saw a small shape curled beneath the heavy branches of a pine. Clara dropped the lantern and fell to her knees, her hands scooping June into her arms. The child was shivering violently, her cheeks red and wet with frozen tears. Clara rocked her against her chest, whispering again and again, "I've got you, sweetheart, I've got you." June clutched at her shawl with stiff little fingers, her voice barely a thread. "I thought you left forever." Clara's tears froze against her lashes. "I thought I should," she admitted, but June shook her head, her words muffled against Clara's coat. "Don't. You make my daddy smile again." The words cut through Clara like lightning, sudden and bright, burning away every lie she had told herself about why she did not belong. Behind them, The crunch of hurried boots broke through the storm. Clara looked up and saw Elias, his lantern held high, snow clinging to his beard, his breath heavy in the cold. His eyes found them, and he dropped the lantern as he fell to his knees. His arms wrapped around both of them, pulling them close, his voice broken with relief. "Thank God," he whispered over and over, his forehead pressed to Clara's shoulder. June reached for him with one hand, the other still clinging tight to Clara. The three of them huddled together in the snow, the storm roaring around them. But inside that circle of arms there was warmth, fierce and unyielding. Elias lifted his gaze at last, his eyes meeting Clara's with a truth so raw it stilled her breath. "I never meant what you thought you heard," he said softly. "I didn't say I didn't want you. I said I didn't need another wife because I already found someone who made this house a home." The sky stretched wide and blue above the valley. The snow of winter melted now into soft earth and tender grass. At the edge of the hollow brook pasture stood a great cottonwood tree, its branches swaying gently in the spring breeze. Beneath it, benches had been set out, plain and sturdy, borrowed from neighbors who had come early to help. Wildflowers filled mason jars along the rows, their colors bright against the wood. There were no lace veils, no golden candelabras, no polished pews, only the earth beneath their feet and the sky above, and it was enough. Clara stood at the edge of the clearing, her hands folded tightly together, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it above the rustle of leaves. She wore a dress she had sewn herself by lantern light, plain cream fabric stitched with careful hands. It was not perfect, but it was hers, and for the first time she wore something that felt like a beginning, instead of a reminder of what she had lost. June stood beside her, holding a small bouquet with both hands, her curls dancing in the wind, her face so proud and solemn that Clara nearly wept. The townsfolk gathered, not out of curiosity, not with whispers sharp as needles, but with eyes softened, with something closer to respect. They had seen her mocked, had seen her stumble, and they had seen her rise again. Elias stood beneath the cottonwood, waiting. His coat was his best, though worn at the elbows, his hat tucked against his side. When Clara walked forward, June skipping just a little at her side, Elias's gaze never wavered. He looked at her, as though she were the only thing in the clearing, as though she had always belonged there. When she reached him, he took her hands in his rough palms steady against her trembling ones. The minister spoke, but Clara barely heard the words, her ears full of the sound of her own heartbeat. When it came time for vows, Elias's voice was low and sure. "I do," he said, not like a man repeating a phrase, but like a man laying down a promise. Clara's throat tightened, her eyes blurring as she whispered her own vow in return. The moment they were pronounced man and wife, June let out a cheer, her laughter ringing through the pasture like bells. The townsfolk clapped, some with smiles, some with tears. No one hurried to leave. They passed around pies and jugs of cider, children chasing one another through the tall grass while the adults spoke in warm tones. For the first time, Hollow Brook did not feel like a lonely ranch on the edge of the world, but a home filled with life. As the sun dipped low, Clara sat beneath the cottonwood, with Elias's hand wrapped around hers, and June curled against her side. She breathed deep of the earth and the air, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. The morning sun spilled through the eastern window of the new room Elias had built, casting long beams of gold across the cedar floor. Clara stood by the shelves he had made with his own hands, her fingers brushing the spines of books stacked neatly beside folded papers. A desk sat beneath the window, polished smooth, waiting for lessons to be written and letters to be penned. She had not thought she would ever have a space of her own, a place not borrowed or mocked or given out of pity, but here it was, solid and warm and filled with possibility. Outside she could hear the sound of June's laughter as the girl chased chickens through the yard, her giggles rising like birds into the soft spring air. By summer, the room was full of children from neighboring farms, their faces eager, their fingers ink-stained as they traced letters on scraps of paper. Clara guided their hands gently, her voice patient, her heart swelling with each small success. She had always believed her size made her less, had believed the words of those who laughed at her, But these children looked at her with trust, not judgment, and Elias watched her with quiet pride. Sometimes she would glance toward the doorway and see him leaning there, his arms crossed, his gaze steady, as though simply watching her was enough to remind him why he had built the room in the first place. One evening, after the last child had gone home, and June had fallen asleep with her drawing pad clutched in her arms, Clara sat alone at the desk. On its surface lay the wooden comb Elias had given her, worn smooth by her touch. She picked it up and held it in her palm, thinking of the day she had nearly walked away, the day she had believed she was nothing more than a burden. Now she knew better. Elias had not saved her. He had not pitied her. He had simply chosen her, again and again, until she began to choose herself too. The room filled with a soft orange glow as the sun set, and Clara whispered aloud to the stillness, "I thought I had to be beautiful to be loved, but being loved made me beautiful." The words did not feel like weakness. They felt like truth, carved deep into her heart. She placed the comb back on the desk and rose, stepping out onto the porch, where Elias waited, his hand reaching for hers without a word. They stood together watching June chase fireflies in the tall grass, her laughter ringing through the evening. Clara leaned against him, her heart full, her soul quiet, and she knew she was not only wanted, she was more than enough. If this story warmed your heart, go ahead and subscribe to Western Love Legends. And do not forget to like and leave a comment. Your support helps keep these tales of love, courage, and second chances alive on the frontier. And remember, even if you cannot bake bread without burning it, someone out there might still think you are worth keeping around.